Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first Columbia X Google Hangout with Professor Eric Foner. We are broadcasting today from the Columbia Center for New Media Teaching and Learning, and just a few housekeeping items before we start. We'd like to put up a screenshot. If you would like to ask Professor Foner questions, just click on the upper right, that small grid area, and then you'll see a QA icon, a dialog box for you to open. That'll open for you to ask questions. You do have to have Google Hangout installed on your machine to ask questions. If we can't get to your questions, put them in the edX discussion forum and we'll try to get to them as soon as we can. And we should be talking for about an hour today. So without further ado, Professor Foner.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and welcome to everybody. It's an interesting experience to communicate this way with people, so I'm happy to respond to questions. Please feel free to post any question you want, and we'll try to get to it. So we'll start with this question from James Sims, who apparently is working on a study of as he says, a Whig from Tennessee. Why did this person abandon the Whig Party, who described himself as an ultra-Whig, abandoned the Whig Party in 1852 in the presidential election to vote for President Pierce, not for Winfield Scott, the Whig candidate? And what would a person like this have done in 1860? Many Southerners Southern Whigs did vote for the Democrats in 1852, mostly because I think they felt the Whig Party was becoming moribund in many ways. And they were very committed to the Compromise of 1850 and settling the slavery issue once and for all, as they kind of thought it would be. And many people like that thought that the election of Pierce would be the finality, as they called it, the final settlement of the slavery question. Then supporting Fillmore in 1856 was not at all unusual for people like that. Fillmore, the ex-president, he was running as the Know-Nothing, or the Native American Party president, but he really represented the old Whigs of the South, the Upper South, and some parts of the Lower North. The Whig Party had pretty much fallen apart by this time, so there was no Whig candidate running. So if you were an Upper South Whig, Fillmore would be probably the most appealing, especially on this ground, again, of unionism. The Democrats by then were not appealing because Stephen A. Douglas had kind of disrupted the whole system with his Kansas-Nebraska Act. A person like this was not going to vote for John C. Fremont, the Republican, so he'd end up with Fillmore. What did most men of this ilk do in 1860, says the question? Well, I'd say they voted for John Bell, from Tennessee, actually, who was the candidate of the Constitutional Union Party, which was another incarnation in some ways of the Southern Whigs. And in fact, Bell did carry a number of the Upper South states. So your subject is a person probably who is searching for a political way to express his strong unionism, and tried in various ways to do that in the 1850s, obviously without total success. Okay, let's move on to our next question, which has to do with, this is from Sam, has to do with filibustering and John Quitman, and one of the filibusterers, and the Franklin Pierce administration. Well, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, filibustering sort of refers to people, Southerners generally, who launched kind of private invasions, little private armed groups invading parts of Central America or the Caribbean in order to, on the hope of annexing them to the United States. Cuba, for example, in this case, or Nicaragua a little bit later. William Walker, the filibusterer, actually established himself as the president of Nicaragua for a while until the Nicaraguans booted him out. But the question here is the Pierce administration and its relationship to this filibustering. And the answer is it's murky. As the question says, different historians describe it in different ways, and that's because the evidence is quite unclear. My personal feeling about this is that the administration didn't strongly support illegal. It was against the law to launch an armed invasion of another country from the United States, although Southern juries were not likely to convict people who did that. I'd say there was a kind of a tacit support, but nothing very open and enthusiastic. You know, if the government of the United States supports invasion of another country, that can lead into diplomatic problems, to say the least. And with Cuba, that was a province of Spain or a colony of Spain, and you didn't want to get into an international altercation with Spain. But after all, this is the period also, 1854, of the Ostend Manifesto, in which a group of American diplomats published this statement saying the United States had a right to get Cuba from Spain, whether they wanted it or not. Spain should sell it to the United States, but if they didn't want to sell it, the United States had a right to go in and just invade and take it. So there was certainly plenty of prominent political figures who endorsed that view and what Quitman was doing, but most of them were not active supporters of this kind of filibustering. Okay, let's see. Here we are. Let's see our next question. Teaching a MOOC. My question is about teaching a MOOC. What about the experience surprised you? What gave you second thoughts? Well, that's an interesting question, and it's a work in progress, and it's certainly an experiment for me. And I have to say that I'm probably the last person one would expect to get involved in a MOOC. I'm very low tech. As people have complained to me, I don't exist in social media. I don't have a Facebook account. I don't have a Twitter account. That's how I get writing done, actually. I've managed to not waste all my time. But what appealed to me about this process is, of course, the ability to reach many people, thousands of people outside of the ivory tower. I've taught for 40 years or more, and I love teaching in a classroom. I enjoy personally interacting with students, but this is a different mode of communicating with people all over the world, people who I would never have any personal encounter with in a classroom. I don't agree, though, with the second part of this question, which is more of a statement, that a rich U.S. history course can be taught online without losing the quality of a face-to-face course. I think there are pluses and minuses to a MOOC, as there are to any mode of teaching, whether a small seminar, a large lecture, or an online course. I do believe, maybe this is just my own experience of many years, that the presence of a teacher in a classroom is very valuable. That the reaction of students and the interchange with students is very valuable. Now, we have our discussion boards, and I try to monitor them, and I have my teaching assistants monitoring them. And, you know, I think that's good, but that's not quite the same thing as responding immediately to a question by a student or having an interchange back and forth with a student in a classroom. So MOOCs have tremendous possibilities for bringing knowledge. I mean, that's my job as a teacher, to spread knowledge. You know, that's what I'm paid to do. And I'm now spreading knowledge far beyond the confines of the university. And MOOCs give the opportunity to do that, and that's a tremendous plus. But there are trade-offs, as in anything. And I would not actually want to see courses at colleges, junior college or community colleges or high schools really go too far down the road of replacing the actual teacher in a classroom with a kind of an online presentation. I think online presentation can be very valuable, can be great supplements, but I hope the real actual teacher will remain in the classroom to deal with students on the day-to-day level, which is a very important aspect of teaching. All right, we'll go to another question here. This is from Dave. Okay, thank you for putting up your question. Do you think that if the South, by the way, I'm repeating this because I know many people who are involved here cannot actually see the question, so I'm going to tell you what it is. Do you think that if the South had been willing to agree to limitations on the conditions of slavery, i.e. not breaking up families, limiting abuse of slaves, it would have been possible to avoid war? Well, you know, as I've said in lecture, nothing is inevitable until after it happens and can't be changed. I don't think the Civil War was inevitable. I think some resolution of the slavery problem was inevitable. It would have to be done. I don't think that this particular scenario laid out in this question would have really solved the problem, limitations on the conditions of slavery. First of all, there were many reformers in the South, particularly religious leaders, who wanted to do exactly what this question proposes. the breaking up of families was seen by many people as a horrific aspect of slavery and a totally un-Christian thing. And as I say, many reformers who were particularly involved with the churches, and the South is a very deeply religious region, said that this is outrageous and that the family bond must be respected, even among slaves. But of course, slaves were property, and the buying and selling of slaves was a essential part of the system. So nowhere in the South was such a provision enacted. Limiting abuse of slaves, well, there were laws which tried to limit the most extreme, sadistic, out of control physical abuse of slaves. It was against the law to murder a slave for no reason, even if it was your own property. And some white people were punished for the most extreme kind of sadistic maltreatment of slaves. But again, really enforcing that was very, very difficult. The number one thing is the property right of the owner is recognized in slavery, and anything that interferes with the property right of the owner would be very difficult to put forward. But anyway, at the bottom of this, I'll refer you to something Frederick Douglass said in his great autobiography, the great fugitive slave who became an abolitionist leader. He talks about the different conditions of slavery under which he lived, but he says, at one point he's treated well, at another point he's not treated so well. He's living on a plantation, he's living in Baltimore. But he says, my complaint was not the treatment. My complaint was being a slave. That was the problem. That's why I ran away. It wasn't that I was treated badly or wasn't treated badly. It was slavery itself that was my problem. So I don't think the amelioration of slavery would have solved the problem. And indeed, it might have actually just led slavery to exist much longer than it did. But I think it wouldn't have convinced anti-slavery people in the North, and it certainly would not have made slaves any more happy to be in the condition of slavery. But it's a good, interesting question. Okay, let's go to our next one. This is from Kay. Thank you for posting it. Can you speak a little on if there were any female voices in the national debate about slavery beyond Harriet Beecher Stowe? Good question. Of course, there were female voices, and I will acknowledge that this course, which does a lot with national politics, Supreme Court decisions, slights the female voices. I understand that, and in a way, I regret it. There was certainly many female abolitionists. The abolitionist movement was a place where many women in the North found a public voice and a way of taking part in public discourse and in politics, not the politics of voting, because women could not vote, but politics defined more broadly as the debate over public policy in the public realm. Women circulated abolitionist petitions. Women gave abolitionist speeches. People like the Grimke sisters, and then Abigail Kelly and others. And they had a voice. They were part of the anti-slavery crusade. Now, the problem, of course, is that the political system at that time had no role for women. They could attend big rallies. They did. Women attended the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They listened like everybody else. They circulated petitions. But they didn't have a direct role in politics. So I would say if you're interested in this, yes, there were plenty of women involved in the anti-slavery movement in one form or another. And there are very good books about this, about female abolitionists, Julie Roy Jeffrey, Blanche Hirsch, others. And then you get people like Mary Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's wife was a political woman. She grew up in a political family. Her father was a member of the legislature in Kentucky. The family was very good friends with Henry Clay, who used to have dinner with them. If Mary Lincoln were alive today, she'd be running for political office. But in the 1840s and 50s, a woman could not do that. So she exercised her political judgment, her political influence via men, via her father, via her husband. And many women were forced to do that in this period, to act through men if they wanted to have a say in the political realm. Okay, we will now move on to the next question. This is from Roland, right? Thank you, Roland. Wait, go back to, I'm reading this question off the screen. Ashworth made a statement, John Ashworth's book, about Eastern made farm equipment being shipped to the Northwest. All you mentioned in a lecture was McCormick in Chicago. How important was Eastern plows and harrows? Well, Ashworth's a good friend of mine, and if he said that in his book, he's certainly correct. McCormick was sort of the quintessential, the McCormick Reaper, was the quintessential farm implement of the 1850s, making possible the Reaper is a machine that helps to harvest the grain crop, and it made possible much larger scale farming in the old Northwest. But certainly the East was where industrialization was taking place. So yes, you had little factories in the East making all of these plows and hoes and harrows and then shipping them out. As I mentioned in one of the lectures, by the 1850s, you have this symbiotic relationship between farmers of the West, of the Northwest, the old Northwest, and manufacturers of the East. The food produced in the West is shipped east to the cities for consumption. Much of the market for manufactured goods produced in the East is out in the West. The population is growing enormously out there. Illinois, where Lincoln comes from, is like the third or fourth largest state in the Union by 1860. So yes, I mentioned McCormick. That's the most famous of all of these. It's like mentioning Andrew Carnegie and the steel mills of him. But of course, there were many other steel companies around, and one can't mention them all. But it's a good question, and a lot of these things from the East did end up in the hands of farmers in the West. Okay, our next question is from Neil. Is that right? No, sorry, William. We're with him. Okay. William Seward, who pops up a lot in our lectures, seemed to move fairly smoothly from position to position, party to party affiliation. In today's terminology, he would be a flip-flopper. How was he viewed at the time, and how were his changes accepted? Well, the term flip-flopper is not one that I actually like. It suggests that the measure of statesmanship is never changing your mind about anything, right? It's not having Lincoln was a flip-flopper. We will see in the Civil War move coming up. Lincoln changed his policy about many things during the Civil War, about race, about slavery. Do we call him a flip-flopper? No, we say this is a guy who evolved, who grew, who was open-minded, who was willing to listen to criticism and learn from it. Lincoln actually had that capacity to rethink his assumptions when necessary. So, one man's flip-flopper is another man's open-minded statesman. But Seward changed parties once, from the Whig to the Democrat, from the Whig to the Republican, and the Whig party died, so he couldn't stay a Whig. So I wouldn't consider that flip-flopping. Most Northern Whigs, like Seward, ended up in the Republican Party, and there was no more Whig party, so they didn't have much of an alternative. Now, it is true, though, and I will grant this question is right about this, Seward's views on slavery seem to bounce around a lot. Seward had a reputation, not totally deserved, as a radical. Now, he was married to an abolitionist woman, and he did have strong anti-slavery views, and he gave a few speeches, like his higher law speech in 1850, which seemed to suggest that people could disregard the law if they wanted to in opposition to slavery. But Seward was also a very cautious and careful politician, and later on, he seems to become more and more conservative. But remember, I think the key point is this. This is a period of radical change, radical change. You could be a radical one year, and if you held the same views, 5 years later, you were no longer a radical. Things had changed. You were a moderate. Seward held the same views all through the Civil War, and he became more and more conservative, or appeared to be conservative, because the times were changing, and more people were becoming more radical in their views about slavery, race, the South, etc. So, many anti-slavery people became unhappy with Seward later in the Civil War because they thought he was becoming more conservative. But maybe what we should really say is the times were changing, and Seward wasn't changing with the times in a way that I think Lincoln did. Okie doke, let's see where we're at now. This is let's see. Neil, is this the one? Yes, this is Neil's question, and let's see, it pops up on the screen. I have a good feel for how the North grew estranged from the South. You've discussed Douglas and Lincoln a lot. However, I don't have a good feel for how the South grew away from the North. After all, they were the ones who left the Union. Good question. And actually, we will come more to that in a week or two when we discuss the secession movement, the rise of secessionist sentiment in the South. I will go back and look at that over the course of the 1840s and 50s. A recommended reading on that week is by Manisha Sinha about South Carolina, of course, the most estranged state in the Union. But I think it's a good question. And one of the points I will make is that there was no South. There was no unified South until the Civil War. And even then, 4 of the slave states remained in the Union. But the Upper South and the Lower South had very, very different points of view in many ways. They were both committed to slavery, yes. But the Upper South, Virginia, Tennessee, the border, Maryland, etc., Kentucky, were much more devoted to the Union and much more wary of the prospect of disunion. They wanted these questions to be solved. This is the home of Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Crittenden later tried to compromise the secession crisis. But I think in the Deep South, in the 1850s, first of all, the Deep South is booming economically. The cotton, the Upper South is a different economy. The Lower South, different, they're growing different things, more manufacturing. The Deep South is the cotton kingdom. It is booming in the 1850s. And that creates this sort of cotton is king mentality, as they called it, that nobody could touch them. They could do whatever they wanted. As Senator Hammond says, South Carolina, no power on earth dares to make war on cotton. And that gave them a tremendous sense of self-confidence when the thought arose of a independent Southern nation. I think in the Deep South, there was a feeling that the future of slavery would be safer, more secure out of the American Union than in it. But we have to remember this, and this will come up in the next couple of weeks. When people talked about leaving the Union, they didn't envision the South just remaining the way it was. They looked for expansion southward. They talked about Cuba. They talked about other Caribbean islands. They talked about parts of Mexico. By the late 1850s, it was clear that slavery was not going to be expanding out into the West. They had failed in Kansas. Much of the rest of the West was inhospitable to agriculture, like Arizona at that time, New Mexico before irrigation, etc. They turned their attention southward, the dream of a Caribbean empire, as one historian called it. And so that sentiment begins to grow more and more important. And by the late 1850s, many, many Deep South, they say, we can't trust the North. Lincoln, well, forget about him, the Republicans, but even Stephen A. Douglas, our previous ally, has betrayed us in the Lecompton battle and in refusing to endorse the Dred Scott's decision of the Supreme Court fully. So you can trace out this growing estrangement as it develops from the mid to late 18. I don't think that in 1840, a lot of Deep South Southerners were talking about this union. And even in 1850, the South Carolina wanted to do it, but none of the other states were interested really in 1850. So the reason I'm focusing on the national politics is that events in the 1850s pushed the South towards secession. It's not just an abstract principle, a set of ideas. It's a series of events that we have seen are pushing people more and more to thinking maybe our future lies outside the American Union. Okay, here's our next question from Dean. Can you talk more about the impact of the abolitionists? How big was the abolitionist influence? Is it possible to compare them to the Tea Party today, a small percentage of the populace that forces parties to be more extreme? Interesting question, and not a bad analogy in some ways. The abolitionists were a small group. They were never anywhere remotely near a majority in the North. And the abolitionists were often fighting among themselves. There were at least 2 major factions of abolitionists. One, the so-called followers of William Lloyd Garrison, who believed in what they call moral suasion, that is using propaganda, persuasion, etc., to attack slavery, but didn't believe in going into politics. In fact, they talked about disunion. They thought the North should secede from the South to, rid itself of its connection with slavery. And then there were the political abolitionists, a larger group, who organized the Liberty Party. Never got a lot of votes, but it began to put this issue on the national agenda. And then there were black abolitionists who operated with both, but seemed to have their own kind of agenda in the 1850s also. So there were groups of abolitionists, but none of them amounted to a very large number, except in a few parts of the North, upstate New York, some parts of New England, the Western Reserve, as they call it, of Northeastern Ohio. There you had very strong abolitionist sentiment. But I think the question is on the right track in that the role of the abolitionists really was to change public sentiment. It was to change the mode of discourse in the society, and in that they had a big effect. The abolitionist agitation makes the politics of a guy like Abraham Lincoln or Seward possible. It helps to create a public sentiment hostile to slavery, not calling for immediate abolition, but still hostile to slavery, and politicians can build on that in their own campaigns. So I wouldn't say that the abolitionists forced both parties to be more extreme, but I think what they did was to force the issue of slavery into public debate. The people who control public debate, the people who control the topics of public debate are more powerful than those who determine a particular policy related to public debate. What is debated and what isn't debated is a central question in any democracy. Slavery was not publicly debated very much in the 1820s and 1830s. By the 1850s, that's all people are talking about in many places. And the abolitionists are partly, not 100%, partly responsible for that. Okay, this is from someone whose email address doesn't really give us their name, Wald, but anyway, thanks. Can you speak on the mindset of the Southern yeoman farmer? The Northern wage laborers and immigrants had a pretty clear set of economic incentives to fight. What about the attraction of the Confederacy to now? Oh, that's a great question, and people always ask that. And I could just take the lowest refuge here and say, wait until the next online MOOC, which will deal with the Civil War. After we're finished with this, in a few weeks, another MOOC comes up where we continue the story. But just briefly, the majority of the white population in the South were not slave owners. They were yeoman farmers, and their families. About 1/3 of the Southern white families owned slaves. So 2/3 didn't. 1/3 is a lot, actually, given the cost of slaves and the centrality of slaves. But nonetheless, why did these people fight? Well, you know, here's an important point I'm going to make in the next MOOC. The cause of a war and why people fight in the war is not the same question, right? This year, right now, in Europe, they are going through commemorations of the outbreak of World War I. 1914. Now, of course, the United States doesn't end until 1917, but in Europe, this is the centenary. There's all this debate, as there is with the Civil War. Why did that World War I happen? Was it conflicts between different imperial powers? Was it an alliance system of great powers that got out of hand? Was it naval rivalry? You know, historians debate. None of those questions have anything to do with why people fought. If you went and interviewed a soldier on the front, he wouldn't start talking about naval rivalry or alliance systems. People fight in a war for personal reasons. First of all, the number one reason people fight in a war is that there's a war. They fight because there's a war on. They're patriotic. Their neighbors are fighting. They're defending their homeland. It's not ideological. Or they fight because they want to show their masculinity. Or they fight because they think it's a lark. In the Civil War, a lot of people enlisted think, it'll be 1 or 2 big battles. I'll cover myself with glory. It'll be a nice experience. Anyway, so why Southern yeomen fought is a good question, but it has very little to do with what the cause of the Civil War was. They fought because an army was entering their area, their territory. They fought because they were loyal to their local region. Eventually, many of them fought because they were drafted into the army. The Confederacy starts conscription in 1862. But the point is, of course, that Southern yeomen felt, even if they didn't own slaves, they felt that the overall social system of the South was beneficial to them. They benefited from slavery even if they didn't own slaves. They benefited because of white supremacy, that it elevated all white people, many people in the South said. They benefited because planters, this is a little fact about the South people don't realize, planters paid most of the taxes. These yeoman farmers lived on these farms where they didn't pay a lot of taxes. They had a lot of economic independence. They grew food for their families, sold a little bit, but most of them were not major market participators. And they were satisfied with the social order that they were living in. And they didn't want the war to destroy it. But we will talk a lot more about this in the next course, about Southern yeomen and their role in the Confederacy. And of course, many of them did not want to support the Confederacy. And as the war went on, more and more Southern yeomen deserted from the armies or refused to enter the armies. Some of them even joined the Union Army. So there is a split as time goes on in the Southern white population, the non-slave only white population, which is one of the things I think that seriously weakens the Confederacy as time goes on. Okie doke, let's go to the next one. This is Neil. Was there any European influence in the 1850s pushing towards Southern independence in the US as a way to reduce tariffs and improve a trade position? Well, first of all, the tariff was virtually non-existent. Despite historians and others who claim this war was about the tariff, the Walker Tariff of 1846, enacted under President Polk, had pretty much eliminated most tariff duties. They were very, very low tariff duties. So I don't think people were riled up about the tariff, either Americans or Europeans. I don't think Europeans, until the Civil War began, Europeans did not pay a lot of attention to the internal political strife in the United States. Once the war began, they paid a lot of attention, and we will talk about that in the next online course. The British paid attention because the British, having abolished slavery in their own empire in 1833, were kind of publicly committed to promoting the abolition of slavery elsewhere. For example, the British tried to negotiate with Texas. When Texas was an independent republic from 1836 to 1844, the British sort of tried to negotiate to persuade them to gradually abolish slavery in Texas. They didn't succeed. The British were trying to get the Spanish to abolish slavery in Cuba. Southerners were very annoyed about that, alarmed about it. They thought they were going to take over Cuba eventually as a major slave place, and they didn't want the British getting involved and urging Spain to embark on a course of abolition in Cuba. So if the British had any interest, it was in promoting abolition, but they knew they couldn't do that in the United States. There was no way the British could tell the United States you got to abolish slavery or not. So I would have to say that the European powers were more or less focused on their own problems. The Crimean War in the, excuse me, the Crimean War in the middle of the 1850s is going on in Europe. Wasn't until the Civil War broke out that Europe really turned its attention in a serious way to what was happening in the United States. All right, this is a question from Barry. Are there fictional treatments of the antebellum period which you would recommend for the insights they afford into those times? A good question. One of my favorite books about that period, a novel which by, I think his name is Edward Jones, a writer, called The Known World. I believe that's the title. It's about slavery in Virginia. The protagonist, oddly enough, is a black family that owned slaves. And there were some black families that owned slaves in the South. But I think Jones's book, it's a novel. It's not a history, although he's obviously read a lot because it's well informed, but it's a novel. It gives you a very good picture of the vagaries of race relations in a slave system, the uncertainty, or I should say insecurity, of the status of free black people. Even though if they're very prominent, they can lose what they have very quickly in that society. I would recommend I would recommend Jones's book, The Known World, as a very good insight into slavery. Now, of course, you can go back to Uncle Tom's Cabin if you want, a novel of the time period, which had a pretty important effect on Northern public sentiment when it was published in the early 1850s. But if you're going to choose one novel at the moment, I would choose that. Another one that I like about the Civil War, now I have to remember the title, which is escaping me, but it's, yes, Cold Mountain, of course, Cold Mountain, because there was a movie made about that also. But the novel is what I'm recommending. This is about the Civil War in Western North Carolina. It actually relates very much to the question we just tried to answer. It's about these yeomen. It's about an area of Western North Carolina where there isn't a lot of slavery. And it's about the inner Civil War, the division in that area between different families, some for the Union, some for the Confederacy, some trying to just stay out of it. And I think Cold Mountain, again, gives you a very good picture of this yeoman world of the Confederacy and the way the Civil War just wreaks havoc on it in all sorts of ways. So that's another novel I would certainly recommend to gain a good insight into this time period. Okay. Here we have a question. What do you make, let's take a look at it. What do you make of Sinha's thesis that the Confederacy was an ultra-conservative, anti-democratic plot led by wealthy not Southern Californian, as I said, South Carolinian lowland planters? Well, Sinha, maybe I should say, Sinha was a doctoral student of mine. So whatever she says is certainly correct. But, or at least I can say she had an excellent education here. She's a well-renowned scholar in her own right now, of course. And by the way, going back to the question about the abolitionists, Sinha has a book coming out maybe in a year or so, a history of the abolitionist movement, a modern history of the abolitionist movement. So keep your eyes out for that. It'll be very, very good. Sinha's a book about South Carolina. So that's why she focuses on the South Carolina planters. And I think South Carolina is the best example of what Sinha is talking about. And I will actually mention this a little in a week or two when we get to the secession crisis. South Carolina was a very undemocratic state. It was the only state where the governor was elected by the legislature, not by popular vote. The legislature was completely malapportioned so that wealthy lowland planters controlled it, even though the white population had spread much more into the upcountry, but the legislature had never really been reapportioned. And those people were anti-democratic, absolutely. They believed in hierarchy, they believed in sort of aristocracy of themselves, and they of course believed in slavery, but they didn't really believe in a democratic ethos for whites either. Now, in the rest of the South, I think that view is perhaps a little less prominent because the structure of politics in the rest of the South was more democratic for whites. We're eliminating the slaves. In South Carolina, 60% of the population are slaves. So as Sinha says at the end of her book, what kind of democracy is this where 60% of the people are off the table to begin with, right? But nonetheless, I think in South Carolina, she makes a very persuasive case that this secession was a counter-revolution. They saw it as a revolution not only against Republican Party control, but against the whole trajectory of the 19th century, which was toward more and more democratic government. And these secessionist planters in South Carolina did not believe in that trajectory. And the Southern Confederacy that they envisioned would be a very hierarchical and undemocratic institution if they have their way. All right, this is from Steve. Thank you, Steve, for posting this question. What are your views on the Johnson impeachment? Did its failure preserve the American... Whoops, what happened to it? Disappeared. This is the problem with technology. But anyway, I read much of it. What about the Johnson impeachment? Now, we're talking here about Andrew Johnson, who was president after the Civil War, as you all know, and after the assassination of... here we go, it's popped back up again. Did its failure preserve the American form of government with 3 equal branches? Was it ever in jeopardy? Etc. Well, I will again begin by saying, wait a while. There's a third move coming up. The second one is the Civil War. The third one, which will begin a couple of weeks after that ends, is Reconstruction. I urge you to take that one, everybody, because Reconstruction is the most misunderstood. A lot of people know a lot about the Civil War. Very few people know a lot about Reconstruction, even though it is an extremely important moment in our history. Johnson's impeachment, I don't think Johnson's impeachment altered the structure of American government one way or the other, any more than the impeachment of President Clinton did in the late 1990s. They were both events that arose out of very, very particular circumstances which were quite different from each other. Although I will say, see, as you know from my lectures, I always try to digress into questions. When little stories, when Clinton was being impeached, I got a call from Geraldo Rivera. Some of you may be aware of him, this TV newscaster, more or less. And they wanted to interview me about the impeachment. And I said, yeah, that's cool. I mean, I think that's part of my job. I'm a professor, put out some views about it. But Geraldo had this theory that both the Clinton impeachment and the Andrew Johnson impeachment were really about sex. Now, the Clinton impeachment, yeah, that's what it was about. I mean, we all remember Monica Lewinsky and all that. That's a whole other story. But the Johnson impeachment and Reconstruction, I said, no, I've done a lot of research. I've never seen any evidence of that. But Geraldo was absolutely convinced of it. So our interview didn't exactly really take very well. He kept asking me about sex, and I kind of talk about civil rights and things like that. So it didn't get very far. But anyway, the Johnson impeachment arose out of the crisis of Reconstruction. And Johnson goes back to another one of the previous questions. Johnson was not a flip-flopper. Johnson was a guy who was totally stubborn, intransigent, and unwilling to change, even when his policies abjectly failed. And Congress got totally fed up with Andrew Johnson for incompetence, stupidity, racism, and many other things. And he was just, how can I put it? He was incompetent as president. He was not up to the job. But that's not what the Constitution says is grounds of impeachment. You have to have committed high crimes and misdemeanors, not just be a total failure as president. And they didn't, in the end, convict him, as you know. But I think Johnson was such a unique character, and his incompetence was so extreme that even if he had been removed, it wouldn't have really had that much effect on subsequent presidents who, whatever their strengths and weaknesses, were not as incompetent to be president as Andrew Johnson was. As you see, I don't think very well of Andrew Johnson, and I will explain in much greater detail when we get to our third MOOC on Reconstruction. Okie doke. James, how did Whigs fare in Alabama in the 1850s as the party broke up? What did most former Whigs do? In Alabama, the Deep South. Now, I must say, I'm not a tremendous expert on the politics of Alabama. If you want to learn about the politics of Alabama, I recommend you read a great book by J. Mills Thornton, Politics and Power in a Slave Society, which is all about politics in Alabama in the pre-Civil War period. And anything you want to know, you'll find in Thornton's book. But I think in the lower South, Alabama is part of the Cotton Kingdom, the Deep South. The former Whigs there went over to the Democrats. They just joined the Democratic Party. Bell didn't get a heck of a lot of votes in Alabama, except in northern Alabama. Now remember, Alabama, if you're from Alabama, you know Alabama is a state with different regions. And the northern part of the state, along the Tennessee River up there, was much less slavery there, many more yeoman farmers. They were much less enthused about the idea of secession. And I think in that area, many of them would go to the Know Nothings and then to the Constitutional Union Party in 1860. But that's one section of Alabama. All the other sections, I think, the former Whigs would just go to the Democrats, and the Democrats then became by far the largest party in Alabama in the 1850s. Okay. What lessons do you draw from the pre-Civil War period as it relates to our contemporary political economy, polarization? By the way, Southern California lowland planters are nasty people. All right, well, this is a interesting question. Yes, there were not planters exactly, but big landowners in Southern California Yes, big haciendas and then yeah, and they didn't have slavery, but they had peonage of a kind or migrant labor, and they didn't treat them all that pleasantly either. Yes. Lessons from the past. I think people who draw direct lessons from the past tend to maybe be more interested in the present than the past. Let's put it that way. If you listen to our politicians, and I'm not talking about any particular politician or party, you'll hear about the lessons of Munich or the lessons of Vietnam. But the lessons of Vietnam were what people want to think now. They find a lesson in Vietnam from it. Some people think the lesson of Vietnam is we should not get involved in wars in places where we have no concept of what that place is like. That's the lesson I would draw from it. And I would apply it to the Iraq War, et cetera, like Vietnam, a place we invaded with no concept of what the history of that place was, the politics of that place, et cetera, and no plan about what to do once we did get there. But other people say, no, the lesson of Vietnam is we should have fought more. We could have won. We kind of didn't really fight a full war. And if we're going to a war, we got to go all the way, et cetera. Well, that's another lesson. So, the lesson of the pre-Civil War era to our contemporary political economy, I actually don't want to answer that question because I think it's more a reflection of your own political view. I have plenty of political views at the present, and I'm happy to discuss them with anybody, but not in this context when we only have about 15 more minutes to talk about the pre-Civil War period. So I'll let that one pass by, okay? All right. Let's see which question we're going to now. Do you have a favorite moment in the Civil War era that sticks out in your mind, or something that humanizes these people, or anything else you've come across? And this is from Bryce. Most of my favorite moments like this actually come from Reconstruction, because I studied much of my scholarly career has been devoted to studying the history of Reconstruction. And to me, this is a preview of the move down the road. Reconstruction is a moment, even though it failed, of tremendous hope and drama, and actually inspiring in the way that people, often coming right out of slavery, tried to create a society of equals, a society of real interracial democracy, something we had never had in the past, and that we didn't have again until 100 years later. So little incidents, a black man trying to acquire land and having to fight off the Ku Klux Klan, or people really taking their life in their hands by becoming local political figures and facing, the danger of violent retribution, or women setting up their own bank accounts and trying to create an independent life for themselves in the aftermath of slavery. I think there's a lot of very inspiring efforts. Or Southern whites who were able to overcome the long legacy of racism and actually try to cooperate with former slaves to build a new society. Not a majority by any means, but there were enough of them that it shows you that people can slough off old prejudices under the right circumstances. So I would say, if you stick around until the Reconstruction MOOC, you'll hear a lot about moments like that, which I think really, they're not giant national political moments, but they can actually inspire students to think about how change takes place in society. There was a question that was popping by down there I thought I would take a crack at, just because it makes me feel good. The question about the Pulitzer Prize. Somebody asked, how did the Pulitzer Prize, let's see what it is exactly. Did the Pulitzer Prize help or hinder what you try to do professionally? Well, getting the Pulitzer Prize is a great honor, no question about that. A great total surprise also. And in fact, I'm probably the only Pulitzer Prize winner who could say the following. That was the spring of 2010. And I was actually on leave, and my wife and I were spending the semester in London because my wife was doing research there on a project of hers. And the Pulitzer Prize was announced like at 3 o'clock by Columbia University on a certain day in April. but it's 5 hours later over there. So it was 8 o'clock, and we were actually out when it was announced at a recital of Indian classical dance. I'm probably the only Pulitzer Prize winner who could say when it was announced, I was at a recital of Indian classical dance. It was kind of good. So I came home. Frankly, I didn't know that that was the day they were announcing the Pulitzer Prize. I came home, and unfortunately, what we do when we come home now is click on your computer and see what email has arrived. And suddenly I see I've got 300 emails. I said, what the hell is this? Did I do something? Did I commit some crime? What is this? 300 emails. And very quickly, of course, everybody I knew, everyone I went to high school with, everyone I went to college with, everybody who claimed they were my cousin and weren't, all said, hey, congratulations, how great you won the Pulitzer Prize. Oh, that's pretty cool. I won the Pulitzer Prize. Then I got an email from my friend Leon Litwack, a Pulitzer Prize winner from 20 years ago, before, as a great historian. He said, from now on, your first name is going to be Pulitzer Prize winner. In other words, whenever you are introduced, Pulitzer Prize winner is your name, not, and that is true. Wherever I go and lecture, it's always Pulitzer Prize winner, Foner, et cetera, et cetera. So that's good. The Pulitzer Prize, I've won quite a few prizes. The Pulitzer Prize is the only prize that actually leads people to buy your book. It actually increases your sales. The Bancroft Prize, another very prestigious prize, I've won that. I was delighted. Didn't have any effect on book sales. So the Pulitzer Prize does make you better known. More people read what you have to say. So it helps you. It helps you professionally. Absolutely. It makes, when you're working on new things, it makes people pay attention, but not necessarily in the scholarly world, but in the larger world, in the media world. I have a book coming out. Here's my ad. In December, I have a new book coming out, and little reviews have already appeared, and they always say, Eric Foner, Pulitzer Prize winner. In other words, it gets more attention, the fact that I won that prize. Should it? Probably not. Probably not. Many, many great books have not won the Pulitzer Prize. Many great historians never won the Pulitzer Prize. But nonetheless, it does get you attention outside the academic world, which is something that all of us like to have. Okay, let's go to our next question here. This is about Abraham Lincoln from Lorraine. Thank you for sending this in. A family legend was that Abraham Lincoln was really, the child of Abraham Enlow, and that his birth date was altered, and he was really the older brother of his sister. Has this been completely discredited? Yes. As Abraham Lincoln said, don't believe everything you see on the internet. Maybe he didn't say that, but he should have said it. Or don't believe everything you read about Abraham Lincoln. There are thousands of books. Every myth, every legend you can imagine about Lincoln is out there. And the story of Lincoln, the real story, is interesting enough in itself that we don't need to make up these other things, that he was an illegitimate child, his birth date was offered. No, I'm afraid not. There's enough evidence out there that Lincoln was really born on the day we think he was born, that his parents were the people we really think were his parents. I don't think these kinds of things deserve a lot of attention. As I say, there are a million conspiracy theories related to Lincoln. There are a million mythologies. I would say pick up a good, solid biography of Abraham Lincoln, of which there are many, many, too many maybe, and David Donald's or Michael Burlingame's 2-volume one, if you want to get the most up-to-date, really deeply researched, although 4,000 pages, maybe a little more than you want to read, or I guess it's only 2,000 pages. That's still a bit much, but you'll get the real story and not this kind of speculation, let's say. Okay. This is getting ahead of ourselves, but if the South had not left the Union, what do you think Lincoln would have been able to achieve? I tend to think he would have been prevented from doing anything by Congress and the courts, by Neal. Well, Lincoln would have achieved what he said he was planning to achieve. One of the things I like about Lincoln is you can believe what he says. He stated what his views were pretty candidly. What was he going to achieve? He was going to achieve preventing the westward expansion of slavery. Yes, they would have achieved that under Lincoln. I think that is absolutely true. Would he have abolished slavery? No, there's no way the president can abolish slavery. Would he have sent an army into the South? No, of course not, unless the South had fired on Sumter. In other words, Lincoln's election was not the harbinger of the abolition of slavery, except maybe in a distant future. But it marked a shift in national power. Lincoln would have appointed people to office who were anti-slavery, not pro-slavery. There would have been different ambassadors representing the United States, different federal officials. He would have tried to encourage the growth of a Republican Party in the South, particularly the Upper South. There wasn't much prospect in South Carolina, but in Maryland, where half the black population was already free, in Kentucky, which was his home state, not totally impossible, Delaware. So Lincoln would have promoted the Republican Party and promoted the principle of the Republican Party, which was opposing the extension of slavery. Now, when Lincoln is elected in 1860, in that same election, the Democrats won control of Congress. Now, they lose it right away because when the South secedes, all those guys leave and the Democrats no longer have majority. But Lincoln, like Obama and other presidents, would have faced a Congress controlled by the opposite party, which limits, again, what they can achieve. So, that's why many people in the South, including Alexander Stephens, who becomes the vice president of the Confederacy, say, why are we seceding at this point? What is Lincoln going to do? What can Lincoln do? Secession is a big gamble. Why don't we wait for some radical act on his part, not just his election? Why does the election trigger secession? Well, we'll talk about that in the last week of this MOOC. But it's an interesting question to think about. What would have happened if Lincoln had just gone on being president with a Democratic Congress and the South still in the Union? Probably not that much would have changed, but Lincoln's election was seen as a fundamental shift of political power toward the North and toward an anti-slavery movement, which the Deep South was not willing to accommodate. Okay, let's see. Let's take that next one about my friend Ta-Nehisi Coates. Have you read Coates's article in The Atlantic, very widely read online and elsewhere, making the argument for reparations? He asked not for cash so much as a focused official national discussion of U.S. culpability for slavery and subsequent mistreatment. Barry, what is your opinion, says Barry? I know Coates. I admire him. He's a great writer. He's one of the few journalists, and I don't say this with any disrespect, or not too much, who actually knows history. Many journalists invoke history who have no idea what they're talking about, especially with regard to the Civil War, I'm sorry to say. Coates knows what he's talking about. He's read books. He's thought about it. I think it was a useful article. Reparations. The idea of paying money to people because their great-great-grandfather was in slavery is not on. It's not going to happen. There are some precedents. Remember, under President Reagan, Congress passed and he signed a law giving reparations or payments to Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II and deprived of all their civil liberties and rights. Now, that only went to actual victims, many of whom had died, of course. But if you were alive in 1987 and had been interned as a Japanese American, you got a payment from the US government. But if you died, your children did not get that. Maybe a better analogy is the annual payments, which still go on, that Germany pays to the state of Israel. There is a German word for that, which I don't know, but that is reparations to a people. People in Israel do not have to be victims of the Holocaust to benefit from the payments that Germany is making as reparation for the Holocaust. I could move to Israel tomorrow as a Jew and become a citizen of Israel. I would benefit, even though I have no connection to the Holocaust. I did not suffer, nor did my parents, grandparents, etc. So that's an analogy. I'm not saying we should do that, but that's an analogy of a broader concept of reparations, not to individual victims, but to a people who have suffered. But I actually like what Coates says. There should be more attention, not just to slavery. I think one of the important points of his article is racial inequality in this country, and we have come a long way. I'm old enough to know that. But racial inequality still exists, And it is the result of slavery, but not only of slavery, of 100 years of Jim Crow, which followed the end of Reconstruction. It's the result of racism even today. Banks that push African-American borrowers into subprime mortgages, which meant that even though they had the same assets as white families, but I mean, there were cases about this. Wells Fargo's bank and others pushing blacks into the dangerous mortgages, which when everything collapsed, many more of them lost their homes, et cetera, et cetera. That's racism, folks. That's not the racism of Bull Connor with his dogs and fire hoses. That's the racism of a guy with a three-piece suit and a pen, but it's still racism. So a discussion of this, I think, would be a valuable thing. But it's not going to happen. It is not going to happen at the moment. We are not in a political situation where people want to have such a discussion. And I think that is one of the points of Coates's article. But it did generate the article itself generated a lot of interest, which I think is a positive thing. Okay, now we are at 4 o'clock. Maybe we'll take another couple of questions and then our Google Hangout will come to an end. This is one from overseas, a British, Alison. Thank you, Alison. As a Brit, she says, I'm glad to hear that's a term which is not considered inappropriate, let us say. Because I've used it in the past. I wonder, is that an insulting term? No, apparently not. As a Brit, the course has already given me much insight, etc. Thank you. Thank you. What do you think Lincoln would say today? Given the results of the recent midterm. You know, if Lincoln were around today, first of all, he would be very, very old and probably wouldn't have a lot to say about current politics. People ask me sometime, I don't oppose asking a question like this, but as you understand, of course, it is total speculation. Total speculation. People ask me, what would Lincoln have said about gay marriage? Lincoln didn't say anything about gay marriage. That was not an issue in the 1850s and 60s. So what would he have said? I mean, he did believe in equality, so that may give us a hint. Lincoln would have been quite surprised at the midterm elections in that the center of gravity today of the Republican Party is the South. Now, of course, they won many seats and things outside the South. But in the heart of the Republican Party today is the South. And of course, in Lincoln's day, there was no Republican Party in the South. It was a Northern party purely. But it's 150 years ago and political alignments change. But I think I'm going to pass on the rest of this question because again, as I said before, all that would be saying Lincoln would agree with me. I think X, Y, and Z about current politics. And I know Lincoln would have agreed. And by the way, nobody can prove I'm wrong, right? One more question, and then we will, and this is from Peter. Is that the one? Yes, okay. Was war inevitable while slavery still existed? And had slavery become totally incompatible with union by 1860? And the answer to that is, even though I don't like the idea of inevitability, probably yes. In the sense that some resolution of the slavery issue had become essential. It did not require war, but in the absence of war, it would require a willingness on the part of the South to contemplate some plan for, no doubt, very gradual ending of slavery. And by the way, Lincoln proposed such a thing, as we will see, over and over again in the first 2 years of the Civil War. Lincoln went to the Upper South, the states in the Union, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, with a plan, very gradual emancipation, it would last a long time, monetary compensation, that is, the owners would be paid for their loss of their slaves, and colonization, that is, the freed people would be encouraged to leave the country because Lincoln thought that the whites in these states didn't want another large free black population. Everybody said, forget it, Lincoln, we are not interested in your plan. They rejected it. Even with emancipation coming down the road without compensation, they rejected it. If Delaware, with 1,800 slaves, turns down this offer, show me a scenario where South Carolina is going to agree to the end of slavery, where Mississippi is going to agree to the end of slavery. So I hate war, but I don't see any peaceful road to ending slavery in this country in the 19th century. So that's what we have to balance off when we think about this period. So we will end there. Thank you all for taking part. It's been an interesting experience, a learning experience for me. I have never been in a Google Hangout before. Maybe we'll do another one. I'm sure we will, actually, in the next MOOC. So maybe I'll see some of you, or at least interact with some of you at that time. So have a nice weekend.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Foner, and thank you all for participating in and asking questions and watching. And we appreciate your participation in the edX discussion forum. Please continue to do that, and we look forward to launching our next MOOC early December, and we hope that you all continue on and participate this way. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.
Okay.